Hi, my name is Dr. Shea, and I'm here to talk to you about what is a seizure. Just so you know who's talking, I'm a pediatric epileptologist, and I founded the El Paso Center for Seizures and Epilepsy, which is a center that focuses on seizures and epilepsy in kids in El Paso. So, if we're going to talk about seizures, we're going to have to talk about the brain. The brain is a very complex organ that's made up of more than 170 billion cells. About half of these cells are neurons, and neurons form this very complex network throughout your brain. Neurons are super cool because they communicate with each other through electrical messages. So a seizure is kind of like an electrical storm. It's increased abnormal electrical activity in the brain. If the storm is just in one part of the brain, it's called a focal seizure. Whereas the seizure activity is on both sides of the brain, it's called a generalized seizure. Sometimes seizures can start in one side of the brain and then spread to involve both sides of the brain. Those are called secondarily generalized seizures. So you might be wondering, what do seizures really look like? Well, that's a complicated answer because there's so many different parts of the brain that do all sorts of different things. So there's parts of the brain that have to do with thinking and memories. There's parts of the brain that have to do with motor and movements. And there's parts of the brain that have to do with sensory systems like vision. So if you have a focal seizure in the occipital lobe of your brain, which is the back part of your brain that has to do with vision, you might just see flashing lights or colorful spinning balls, but you're completely aware and you can be like, hey, dude, do you see that? And you don't have any sort of shaking or jerking movements like you see on TV. If you have a seizure in the temporal lobe of your brain, which is on either side, this part of the brain has to do with thinking and memories. And if you have a seizure there, you might just kind of look around slowly. You're not aware of what's going on. So if somebody calls your name, you might look at them, but you don't respond because lights are on, but nobody's home. If you have a seizure in the primary motor cortex, which is a strip right over the middle of your brain, that's when you're more likely to have the generalized stiffening and shaking like you see on TV. So how are seizures diagnosed? Well, you've probably heard the term EEG or electroencephalogram. This is a non-invasive test where we paste wires called electrodes over different spots on your scalp. And where each electrode is placed is measured, and it's very precise so that we know what electrical activity is coming from what region of the brain. And what we get is a readout that looks kind of like this with lots of squiggly lines, and we know where each of those belong on the brain. So this is what an EEG looks like. And if you look at the left half of the screen, that's what normal brain activity looks like. And then you see right around the middle of the screen, there's a really big change. And all of a sudden, there's big, crazy activity on the right side of the screen. And that's what seizures can look like. If the activity is just seen in one side of the brain, that's a focal seizure, like we were talking about earlier. But if it's generalized seizure, we see that seizure activity on the EEG on all the electrodes. So in review, neurons are brain cells that communicate with electricity. A seizure is like an electrical storm. It's abnormal increased electrical activity in the brain. What seizures look like depends on what part of the brain is involved. And we diagnose seizures using EEGs. So I hope you come back for other videos on topics like what causes seizures, what should I do during a seizure, and what is epilepsy? Take care.